Hello and welcome to Classics 392. I cannot be here in person with you today because I think about the time when class starts, my plane will be touching down in San Francisco. So I am obviously not there because I'm in San Francisco for a conference, and I will be back next week and we will continue as normal and have normal lectures and not video lectures for the rest of the term. Assuming that we don't all get snowed in or hit by some horrible ice storm or something. Okay, so Classics 392 is in many ways a simple continuation of Classics 391. We will continue reading Latin, we will continue thinking about both the grammatical meanings and why things are ablatives and why they are accusatives and why they are subjunctives. And we will continue slowly getting more into thinking about larger issues, thinking about the Latin that we read as literature and not simply as a puzzle that we have to decode to figure out what on earth the words say. So I'm going to begin by talking a bit about the syllabus, which you should all have a copy of by now, given that it's been on Moodle for quite some time. And I will talk about a few of the things on it, and then we will go on to talking about an introduction to Latin epic and to Latin epic meter and a few other bits and pieces that are new to you this term. Okay. So most of what I'm going to talk about on the syllabus is the evaluation things, especially things that are new or slightly different than they were last term. Okay, so class participation. Class participation, as is usual in my Latin classes, is fairly significant. It's 15%. In order to earn that 15%, you need to be here, you need to be in class. You need to be clearly prepared and able to read, translate, and answer grammar questions. That means you're not getting full marks just for being there. If you consistently cannot answer my questions or will not answer my questions, you will lose some of your participation marks for that. But if you're here and prepared and participating in every single class, you will get 15 out of 15. If you aren't sure, if you're concerned, if you don't want to answer questions because you're not sure if you're right, try anyway. Trying will get you some marks. Refusing to answer questions will get you no marks. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is the sight translations. If you have taken classes with me before, you've already had sight translations. If you haven't, perhaps you have, or perhaps you haven't, I don't know. What this is it's a piece of Latin that you've never seen before. You get some vocabulary help, but you are expected to translate it as best as you can into a reasonable English version. In this class, it will be poetry, because this class is called Reading Latin Poetry. I will stick to authors of the classical era, which is roughly the late Republic through to the early Empire. So I won't, for instance, be putting on Plautus, who is a playwright of the Middle Republic, and I wouldn't be putting on poetry from the very end of the Roman Imperial period. The language in those time periods might not be familiar to you, whereas the classical period, that's the Latin that people tend to learn in their first year courses, and so we'll stick with the classical period for now. The sight passages will be about 10 to 12 lines of Latin poetry. This is up from the sight passages for Latin prose, where they were about 8 lines. The main reason for this is that lines of poetry are shorter than lines of prose. There is a section on the evaluation for prose composition. What this is that I will give you a paragraph in English and you will translate that paragraph into Latin. Latin prose. Not poetry. I do not expect you to compose poetry. As you will see, there are a lot of rules for how you make poetry in Latin, and I know from trying it myself that it is very difficult, and it's not something I would expect of any of you at this level. Everybody is going to have to do an oral report in this class. Each of you will be assigned an author to report on. You can do the report alone or in pairs. There are only 2 spots for pairs. That's Virgil and Ovid, because they're the ones who have sort of the largest body of material. Next week, I will assign the authors. So let me know by Monday if you want to be in a pair or by yourself. If you don't care, you don't need to tell me. But if you specifically want to be in a pair, or if you specifically don't want to be in a pair, let me know by Monday. I may not be able to accommodate everybody's requests simply because there are only 2 authors that I'm planning to assign to pairs. Your textbook has a list of suggested reading. This textbook. It's on pages XXIV and XXVII. That's 24 to 27 in Roman numerals. And you should start there for the research you do for your oral report. Your report should cover the author's career and life and times, so much as we can know, the major themes of their poetry, and the major current directions of study. This is meant to be a broad overview. You don't have to do in-depth research on particular poems or particular scholars, but you should be able to present an overview of what's important to know about Ennius or Ovid or Lucan, and what kind of things scholars seem to be interested in right now. Then we have the translation test. The translation test will only cover passages we have gone over in class. They will involve a translation of 10 to 12 lines from Latin into English, and I will also underline words and phrases and ask you questions about them. Ask you to explain what case a noun is and why, or what kind of subjunctive a verb is. The translation project can be on a passage of Latin poetry of your choice, but you do need to approve it, to have me approve it beforehand. Some passages are simply going to be too difficult for you, and I will know that better than you will. And also I want to make sure that some passages are too difficult for anybody because there are problems with the manuscripts, in the sense that, like, the passage as we have it, as it's come down through the tradition, doesn't make any sense. And again, I'll be able to sort of search out those passages and make sure that you haven't accidentally decided you're going to translate something that's untranslatable. Finally, the final exam will be the equivalent of 2 translation tests plus 1 sight test plus a commentary passage. A commentary passage is, if you haven't had this from me before, it is when I give you a passage of poetry, in this case, and I will ask you questions about it. So I might ask you to identify the people who are speaking in the passage. I might ask you to tell me the significance of words or phrases in the passage for the larger themes of the poem and that kind of thing. And this is where you get tested on the the discussions that we will have about the larger significance of the poetry and its cultural relevance and that kind of thing. Okay, one last thing about the syllabus before we move on to talking about epic is about the book. This book right here. We are working from a reader of passages from 10 different epic poems. The passages have been selected to give you an overview of the different authors of Latin epic poetry and their different styles, and also to give you at least one example of a bunch of common set pieces in epic. A duel, an ekphrasis, which is a term that means a description of it's a descriptive passage, usually describing a decorative object or a landscape. And then there's also prophecies, dreams, tree felling scenes. These are all scenes that we see over and over again in epic poems, and this reader has selected a variety of them so that you can get a sense of these standard scenes and how they fit into the Latin epic tradition. The passages have also been selected to be doable by students who are at your level of Latin. We will do at least one passage from each author, depending on how fast we move, and we will stick to the schedule. So we will be doing Ennius for as many days as the schedule says we're doing Ennius. Whether or not we have read all of the Ennius passages, we will move on to the next author when we are done those days. So that's all I have to say about the syllabus and the textbook. If you have any questions about any of these things, you can certainly email me or you can ask me on Monday. Because now I'm going to move on to be talking about epic. Okay. All right. So, we will begin with our first slide here, which is entitled Epic Poems. This class focuses on epic poetry, poems in the epic meter. And it really is important here to note that epic refers to the meter, not the style of the poems or the subject matter. Epic poems do tend to have very similar styles and subject matters, but ultimately what makes an epic epic is its meter, not anything else. So that's what the word epic means when we're talking about poetry. And I will show you in just a few moments what I mean by epic meter. Epic poetry is the highest status of the poetic genres, and you really can't overestimate how important epic poetry was and how serious epic poetry was taken in antiquity. There isn't really anything comparable to it in modern literature, I don't think. There really is nothing comparable to the seriousness that epic poetry had in antiquity. It could be politically important. It was definitely socially important. It was definitely culturally important. Suitable topics for this very serious type of poetry include mythology, history. We have didactic epics, which means teaching, heroic tales, and adventures. In Roman times, I would say they tended to be more interested in historical epics, especially early on. So the first epic we're going to look at, Ennius, is an epic poem about the history of Rome up until Ennius's time. And this was considered a perfectly reasonable way to write history in this time period. Didactic epics are often the ones that people find most surprising. So serious subjects would be taught through poetry. There are some good reasons for this. In a world where not everybody had access to written materials, it makes sense to teach things through poetry because poetry is easier for people to memorize. It's easier for them to remember than prose. But even when we have writing becoming more widespread, epic poetry still is a way to talk about serious topics that nobody would think of writing poems about today, I think. So we'll get poems of philosophy. Lucretius, we're going to read some Lucretius. Lucretius wrote a poem about philosophy, about Epicurean philosophy. It contains things like the earliest articulated theory of atoms, like as in, matter getting broken down to tiny parts. This is in poetry. This is perfectly normal and acceptable for the Romans. The epic meter and epic poetry seems to have originated in ancient Greece. The earliest examples we find there are Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. It was first used for Latin poetry by the poet Ennius in his work called the Annales, which was written in the early 2nd century BCE. The Romans had their own poetic tradition. There were poets working in Rome, writing similar historical epics and that kind of thing in pre-Ennian times. but we don't really know very much about them because nobody bothered writing them out anymore or copying them out anymore after the popularity of Ennius and epic poets after him. So I have mentioned that we're going to look at the epic meter, and here on this slide you can see it is about the epic meter. So the epic meter is the dactylic hexameter. That is what it is called. This is the meter of epic. The basic pattern is on the second line of the slide there with those dashes and U's. A dash, a long dash like that, means a long syllable, and a U like that means a short syllable. So the basic pattern is dum dida dum dida dum dida dum dida dum dida dum dum. That is what an epic line sounds like in its most basic form. Syllables are arranged into groups. Each group is called a foot. A foot in an epic line, or a standard foot in an epic line, is a dash and two little U's. It's a dum dida. There are 6 feet in a hexameter line. Hex is Greek for 6. So this slide shows you some types of feet that are possible in a dactylic hexameter line. So there are 3 types of feet that can appear in one of these lines. So we have dactyls, which is where the dactylic hexameter gets its name from. And a dactyl is a long syllable followed by 2 short syllables. Then we have a trochee, which is a long syllable followed by a short syllable. The trochee can only appear in the very last foot of the line. And then we have a spondee, which is 2 long syllables. The final foot of a dactylic hexameter has to be a trochee or a spondee. That means the final foot has to have only 2 syllables, and it can be either long, short, or long, long. The other 5 feet of a line can be either a dactyl or a spondee, which means that any place you have a dactyl, you can replace it with a spondee, and that's because if you have 2 short syllables, you can always replace them with a long syllable in hexameter. A spondee in the 5th foot is unusual, though. So if you see what they can happen, but they're unusual, and they usually suggest that the poet has put it there for some very emphatic reason. So a long syllable. Okay, actually, I'll start. A short syllable will have a short vowel. A long syllable will either have a long vowel in it, or it will have a short vowel followed by 2 or more consonants. Your dictionary and your intro textbook mark long vowels. So long vowels have a line over the top, a macron. Short vowels don't. Because we know that we have these patterns of long and short syllables, we can sometimes use the meter to figure out what case a word is. So for instance, if you have a word like Luna, L-U-N-A, so that's a first declension noun. If the A at the end of Luna is short, it's a nominative. If the A at the end of Luna is long, it's an ablative. So the meter can actually tell you whether or not that noun is a nominative or an ablative. Note that the meter means that no more than 2 short syllables can ever come in a row. This can restrict what words can be used in this kind of poetry. A word that had 3 short syllables in a row simply could never appear in Latin hexameter. This is also the reason for, you may recall, those alternative endings to some verbs. So for instance, the 3rd person plural perfect indicative active. It has two possible endings, and one of them is easier to put into hexameter than the others. Because the words must fit the meter, word order is even less regular in poetry than in prose. Your words in your sentence are going to get split up, moved around, put all over the place so that they will fit the meter properly. Try reading aloud in meter to get a feel for poetic effects, such as lightness, swiftness, stumbling, smoothness, etc. A line that has more dactyls will sound lighter. It sounds like it moves faster. A line that has more spondees sounds heavier. It sounds like it moves slower. And occasionally lines will be difficult to say or seem kind of weird on purpose, and I'll talk about those when we actually see them, how metrical effects can affect meaning. Finally, we do need to talk about a few other terms that are relevant for Latin verse. One thing that's important to know when you are reading is, and when you're trying to figure out the meter of a line, is to know about elision. Elision basically is a process where vowels will get swallowed up and syllables will disappear. It's something that happens more often when people are talking. Think about how when you are talking, you might just leave off, for instance, the final G of a word that ends in ing. People will say talkin' instead of talking. In English, this kind of thing also happens with contractions. So we will turn we'll turn are not into aren't. We'll turn is not into isn't. And it's a way of sort of shortening things down, making it flow more quickly. Poetry does this with elision. So the basic rule for elision is that if a word ends in a vowel and is directly followed by a word that begins with a vowel, the vowel at the end of the first word will disappear, and that means its syllable will disappear. Thus, for instance, ipse Antonius, if those two words were found in that order in a line of poetry, it would be pronounced ipse Antonius. And the E simply disappears from the pronunciation, and it also disappears from the meter. So when you see it written, it will be written with the E still there, but when it's pronounced, the E is gone, and the E will not show up in the syllables that count for the meter. So ipse Antonius has ips Antonius, 5 syllables, whereas ipse Antonius, ips Antonius, has 6. One of those syllables will disappear if you see those words in poetry. Okay. So there are a few other letters that kind of get treated as vowels. For instance, if you have a vowel followed by the letter M at the end of a word, and then a vowel beginning the next word, the vowel plus M at the end of the word will be treated as though it's simply a vowel. So my example, ipsum Antonium would be pronounced in poetry as ips Antonium. The UM simply disappears in the pronunciation and is not counted as part of the syllables for the meter. Similarly, if you have the letter H at the beginning of the word, it basically disappears. It gets treated as a vowel. If you have a vowel at the end of one word, and then the word immediately after that begins with H plus a vowel, the vowel at the end of the first word will disappear. And my example here, ipse Horatius, would be pronounced ipsoratius. So that E, again, disappears. And the H also disappears. And then, of course, rarely you might have an M and an H, those last two rules I just explained, at the same time. So you might have, if you had a vowel plus M at the end of one word, and then H plus a vowel at the beginning of the next word, like, for instance, ipsum Horatium, that's pronounced ipsoratium. So the UM disappears and the H disappears, and it's just ipsoratium when you pronounce it. But of course, written out in the poem, it's always going to be there. So when you are trying to work out the meter of something, do pay attention for these places where there's going to be elision. Some poets use elision much more than others. It is relatively less common in Virgil and relatively more common in Catullus, for instance. So now I have a few other terms to give you that have something to do with poetry, and these terms you will see when you're reading about it. You may see them in the commentary in the book. So make sure. So you should know what they mean. Just go back and take a look at this slide if you forget. And I will talk about them and their significance when I think it's important. Okay, so we have diaeresis. Diaeresis is when a foot and a word end together. Some poets really value this. Some poets do try to make a foot and a word end at the same time. Some don't. It can have various effects. A caesura is a place where a word ends inside of a foot. So let me think of an example. I can't think of any examples. I'll point out examples when we actually have poetry in front of us. That actually seems like a more appropriate thing to do anyway. Okay, so there are two kinds of caesuras. We have a strong caesura, which is when a word ends after the long syllable in a foot. And then we have a weak caesura, which is when a word ends after the short syllable in a foot. A strong third foot caesura is the most common type to find in Latin. And I will point one out when we are actually looking at some poetry next week. Speaking of which, for Monday, we will read the first passage of Ennius, which is entitled Ilia's Dream and is on page 2. For Wednesday, we will be reading the second and third passages of Ennius. The second one is called Romulus and Remus Take the Auspices, and it's on page 3. And the third one is called Felling of Trees and is on page 4. This means we will be reading a total of 42 lines of poetry next week. I strongly recommend that you split this assignment up into roughly equal amounts and do a little each day. And I definitely recommend that you do at least part of the assignment for Wednesday over the weekend, so you're not stuck having to do all of it on Tuesday. There is more material assigned for Wednesday than there is for Monday, because on Monday I'm also going to be introducing Ennius. So make sure that you don't put yourself in a position where you can't get the homework for Wednesday done. One other thing that I want to point out before I finish up this video is again, it's about your book. So the passages are on page 2, 3, and 4. But if you flip further back, you will find commentary. And this commentary, unlike the commentary, the little notes and stuff in the book that we used last term, is actually quite useful. You will find your reading much easier if you look at the commentary while you're reading. So starting on page 31, there is commentary for every passage in the book. This commentary ranges from things like when an adjective is being used like an adverb, weird constructions, will give you help with weird constructions. It might tell you who precisely a sentence is talking about. Like, for instance, you've just got a third person singular verb with no name attached to it. It'll tell you who that is, and that can really, really ease your writing. It'll also tell you things like, it will sometimes give you a hint about what kind of ablative is happening. If there is weird language being used in the passage, if there are words that you're not likely to know, if there are constructions that are archaic and so you wouldn't have likely learned in your first year class, the commentary will help you with those. So please use the commentary. Also, there is a vocabulary at the back of the book. Starting at page 141, there is a vocabulary. It doesn't have every word. I mean, it expects you to know words like... Actually, it's got a lot of the words. It might not have every single word that you will come across, but it will have many of them. I'm just looking here, and it's got like weir and wea, which are really words that you probably should know anyway. But if we've gone that far to putting those words in the vocabulary, most of the words you need are going to be in there. And this is good because if you go to your dictionary, you will often find 10 different definitions. This is going to give you 3 or 4 definitions, and somewhere in those 3 or 4 definitions, there's going to be the right one. So if you can't find what you need in the dictionary, if you can't find what you need in the vocabulary, then you will have to go to the dictionary, but you should go to the vocabulary entries first. All right. So, again, first passage of any is for Wednesday, first passage of any is for Monday, second and third passages of any is for Wednesday. I will be back. My plane will be coming in to Montreal very, very early Monday morning. So hopefully, I expect to be in class on Monday, given that it is winter, and there could be complications. It's, not outside of the realm of possibility that might not happen. However, I will certainly let you know if I have run into any travel difficulties. And if you don't hear otherwise, just assume there's a normal class on Monday. And I will see you then. Bye.